So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm very pleased to welcome such a full audience here for today's lecture. Before we get into that, I wanted to recommend to everybody to pick up one of our flyers with the program for the fall term, or for those of you out there on the internet, go to our website. I want to especially recommend two upcoming lectures. On October 24th, we have Ilka Yilmaz from the Freie Universität Berlin. So there's a sort of a German theme in this, right? Speaking about Ottoman passports, security and geographical mobility, 1876 to 1908. And less than 2 weeks later, we'll have Azal Özdemir, our Manoogian Postdoctoral Fellow here at Michigan, speak on a closely related topic, actually, the vote never to return, Armenian transatlantic mobility and abandoned Ottomans. So that's coming up on November 5th. So make sure you get our email announcements, or as I said, pick up a paper flyer. And we'll look forward to seeing everybody there as well. It's my particular pleasure today to welcome back to Michigan, David Leupold. Speaking of Manoogian postdocs, David was a Manoogian postdoc here in 2018-19. Prior to that, he had studied modern Middle East studies at the University of Bamberg, and then obtained an MA in social sciences in a joint program between Humboldt-Universität and the Middle East Technical University in Ankara. And then he obtained his PhD at Humboldt-Universität with a study titled Bridging Memories in a Contested Geography, Eastern Turkey, Western Armenia, and Northern Kurdistan. That was in 2018. And he subsequently turned that into a book titled Embattled Dreamlands, The Politics of Contested Armenian, Turkish, and Kurdish Memory, out from Routledge in 2020. And for those who are here in the room, we have a couple of flyers with a discount code. So if you interested, feel free to pick one up and get the book with a discount. Currently, David is a principal investigator for a project conducted at the Leibniz-Zentrum Moderner Orient, again in Berlin. He has obtained funding for an individual research project titled Relicts of Another Future, the Afterlife of the Socialist City in Central Asia and the Southern Caucasus. This is sponsored by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. And this will eventually feed into a book project, Life After Future, about the urbanities of the former Soviet South. So today's talk, entitled for us, The Deserts Are Buzzling Cities, Early Soviet Yerevan Between Armenian Futurism and Post-Persian Retrotopia, is part of that project. And David is going to be giving related talks in the coming weeks at our partner institutions at UCLA and UC Berkeley, both of which, by the way, are our co-sponsors in today's event. So we're very grateful to them. Those, just like today's talk, those will be streamed online, will not be the same topic. So if you want to have sort of the full cycle of this, be sure to follow the announcements, which we'll have on our Facebook page and in our email announcements as well. And with that, I have the pleasure to welcome David to the podium. Thanks for coming. And turn the microphone over to you. Yep.
All right. Thanks so much for this kind invitation. And before I delve into my talk, I want to extend my special gratitude to Vegan for setting this up. I think without you, this wouldn't be possible. thanks also to all the sponsors at the University of Michigan for having me here. And I hope that I will offer a kind of interesting new insight into my research. You're actually the kind of genia picks. This is the first time I'm delivering this talk. So if it won't be eloquent at every single moment of the talk, like, please bear with me. So in some sense, the talk gives a kind of initial glimpse into, okay, let's see, just moving on. Oh yeah, perfect. It offers an initial glimpse into chapter 3 of an upcoming second monograph, which I provocatively titled The Death and Life of Southern Soviet Cities, Urban Futures and Their Afterlives, obviously in allusion to Jane Jacobs' scathing critique of architectural modernism. So it's a kind of critique of the critique. Here, I'm interested specifically in a kind of question that forms the point of departure, that is, what does life after the future look like? That is the future projected by socialists, by the Soviet experiment. What does it mean 3 decades after the fall of state socialism to live in cities designed for a future that never arrived? So in exploring this question, what is left of the future city, this book seeks not only to trace the material and mnemonic remnants left by Soviet urbanization, but to reveal how Soviet discourse on cities sometimes sparked radical ideas that were left off the Soviet project. This is a kind of play on words I borrowed from Ronald Sunny, which transcended the constraints of state socialism itself. That is, they were politically left off Soviet politics. Here, 2 reasons prompted me to bring the Soviet South into the spotlight. First, this lingually and culturally diverse geography hosted some of the most far-reaching experiments in urban design, yet it has remained largely marginalized until today in wider scholarship, largely owing to post-colonial epistemic asymmetries, too much focus not only on Russia, but the entire, I think, northwestern part of the former USSR. Second, while certain parts of the post-Soviet space, like the Baltics, achieved relative economic prosperity of the Cold War, many urban centers across the former Soviet South are grappling here with new cycles of dispossession and severe ecological crisis. It wasn't just a happy communist future that failed to arrive, but the post-Soviet feast of wild dreams, characteristic of the 1990s, also faded gradually, giving way to the 21st century hangover of a bleak and seemingly eternal capitalist present. So this is the kind of point of departure. As you will see, I draw here from primary sources in both Armenian, Kyrgyz, Russian, but also in Slovak and Czech, because I have some work on Czechoslovak internationalists, which also feature in the book, and try to weave a polyphonic account of what it meant to build a city towards communism. You will see, I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of how the overall index will look like, so that you see where the research that we'll be talking about today is located. And you see a conceptual chapter of what is left of future city, which is then followed by a chapter on Esperanto-speaking city builders. There I try to reconstruct the vision of a bottom-up urbanity and the role of Esperanto-speaking internationalists from Czechoslovakia. And from there on, I move to the current chapter 3, which will be also basically what I will be talking about in the following around 40 minutes. And then this is followed by another chapter on polycentric urbanity. And then I move here to the post-Stalinist period. We see the late Soviet period, the idea of deperipheral urbanity. These are all things I'm happy to talk about in more detail in the discussion. And it will end with a chapter on reappropriation of Soviet materiality, or the limits of reappropriation of Soviet materiality in the present. So the book will take you from the early Soviet period until the current present. But let's move back towards around 100 years ago. That is the time of the October Revolution, or to be precise, 2 years after the October Revolution. The more the people's class pride grows, the more it will despise to imitate the rich citizen and independently create its own style tailored to their life reality. Notes here in a youthful revolutionary spirit, a 36-year-old Walter Gropius, 2 years after the October Revolution. From the beginning of the Soviet experiment, the city was here understood as the main laboratory where a post-revolutionary and ideally classless society was to be forged. Yet at the same time, the city transpired here as an embattled site for opposing visions, taking at face value the call of Marx and Engels to obliterate the boundary between city and countryside, or the contradiction between city and countryside, as is put in Engels' works, this urbanist like Mikhail Ochitovich imagined socialist housing here as something resembling Los Angeles, like a series of road and rail networks trailing light industry along an endless suburban territory. Other urbanists, which specifically those from the Armenian Studies Department will be very familiar with, like, for instance, Tamanyan, which we'll talk about today a lot, he sought to go back to Ebenezer Howard's vision of a garden city, refurbished in the Soviet context into a Gorod Sad. Yet, the quest for forging novel architectural style was neither confined to a mere import of Western expertise, nor limited to a geographical center, echoing instead the historian Mihail Fowler's call to recognize, I quote, the position of the periphery as central to early Soviet cultural production and reception. It must come as no surprise to see how the former geographical margins of the Tsarist Empire emerged here at the forefront of this quest as an independent style tailored to the life realities of extremely diverse populations, to bring again the quote from Walter Gropius in. Responding here to Stalin's call to combat, I quote him here, the remnants of great Russian chauvinism, пережитками великорусского шовинизма, local actors felt politically empowered and also ideologically legitimized, we're talking about the early Stalin period, we know what will happen later, to reassert what they perceived as their own. That was, of course, under the umbrella of the Karenization policies, which I think I will not go into much in detail here. And architecture was seen as the field of representation in which this new national consciousness should be made visible. However, in pursuing the new, local actors often resorted to the old. By doing so, they construed complex polytemporal horizon, blending the utopia of a future communism with Retrotopia and an excavation of multiple indigenous pasts. Zygmunt Bauman, the Polish sociologist who coined the notion, understands Retrotopia as the yearning for a romanticized past in face of the uncertainties and discontents of modernity. However, what we see here is traditionalism in the context of the early Soviet did not necessarily oppose modernism, but instead served it as an inspirational building material in a quite literal sense. Renowned patterns found in teke carpets adorned facades in Soviet Turkmenistan and Kyrgyzstan. Architects in Soviet Kazakhstan emulated local housing traditions built with straw and reed, while in Soviet Ukraine, proponents of neo-Baroque and constructivism fought a fierce struggle for discursive hegemony. In Soviet Azerbaijan, particularly interest was devoted here to its Perso-Islamic heritage, of course, refurbished as national Azerbaijani heritage. Architects rediscovered here the Shirvan Absheron Architecture School, or Shirvan Absheron Memalik Mektebi, which developed around the 8th, 9th century upon this architectural principle of the Sassanid period across the territory of present-day Azerbaijan. In stark contrast, and now we're slowly approaching our topic, in contrast to Soviet Azerbaijan, which drew here mainly from its eastern, quote-unquote, Perso-Islamic heritage, neighboring Armenia should follow a distinctly different trajectory. Spearheaded by the urban planner and neoclassicist architect Alexander Tamanyan, they sought to blend Armenian medieval architecture with Western neoclassicism in an effort to forge a paradigmatic style retrospectively framed as Neo-Armenianism. Tamanyan's signature building, the People's House of Yerevan, or the future Yerevan Opera, constitutes, in his own words, an attempt at combining the spatial ideas of the Roman Colosseum, here we have it, with Svartnots. The later here refers to the ruins of a 7th century Armenian church built during the first Muslim Arab raids. Tamanyan's syncretic approach came to be more and more understood as a blueprint for the architectural reconstruction of authentic Armenianness, or Hayotsiun. Ironically, there's always irony to history. However, the construction of this building required the demolition of a physically existing medieval Armenian chapel, which just sadly had occupied the place since the 12th, 13th century only. Levon Abramian, one of the leading Armenian sociologists, which I will quote, put it as following: Tamanyan was looking back not at the recent past, but a far more distant past. Well, his retrospective view was aimed at the ancient past that he had invented. Yet, by no means all would buy into the past that he had invented for early Soviet Armenia. And this is why we now slowly approaching what I would call a counter-hegemonic cause. That is the cause of a kind of amorphous group of surrealist writers, constructivist architects, which were operating under the label of Armenian Futurism. And we'll see this in a little bit more in detail. And we'll see what they brought to the table, which we see quite differently from the kind of neoclassicist architecture that animated Tamanyan. We'll see it was more a quest for a new East that is not Arabic, that should transpire as their main motivation. We see here like a picture, one rare picture where we get all of them together: Isabella Kodabashian, Yegeshi Charens, Matiros Saryan, and Mikhail Mazmanyan. We'll come back to the left one. He will occupy an important place in the following talk. In 1921, in what is retrospectively dated as the birth of Haikakan Futurism, Armenian Futurism, the writer Yegeshi Charens, which you see here also on the right hand, and the two poets Azat Bishtuni and Georg Abo delineated the contours of the futurist political thinking in their Deklarația Yereki, the manifesto of the three. In it, the authors expressed their disdain for Armenian national romanticism as they understood it, seeing in it, and I will quote it directly from their manifesto, a cell of literary tuberculosis, bearing the fruits of, I quote, nationalism, romanticism, pessimism, and symbolism. So where Armenian national romantics looked for the restoration of a lost Hyrenic homeland, they sought to foster proletarian internationalism, proletarian internationalism, where what they sought as Armenian national romantics cherished the image of an unblemished love, anbitser. They saw mere healthy sexual instinct, serakan aroch benast. Echoing here, futurists in Soviet Ukraine, Armenian futurists likewise envisioned an urban pathway that was to lead Soviet Armenians out of what they saw as the desert and solitude, anapat imenotion, of national imagination, back into the bustling cities, or Basma Shukhor Kagne. We can discuss what will be the ideal translation for Basma Shukhor. That's a whole nother topic of the present age. This and there we have the quote for us: the desert are bustling cities, busy cities, difficult to translate. They declared this resolutely in the manifesto. What was clear? The city and not the rural idol were the place which was sought and where the new national identity was to be constructed. This manifesto was followed 3 years later by something very interesting, which is the first and only issue of a magazine by and for Armenian futurists, Standard. The cover of the magazine is a photo montage composed of Lenin and a jobbing press, which you can see, next to which a provocative quote from Max Grundrisse challenges the reader to question the role art to play in the age of the machine. Also interesting that this is a quote from Grundrisse, because these are things that will become quite against the hegemonic state canon, right? We're talking here about not the mainstream Marxist quotes. So can Achilles, I hope I pronounce them right in English, be achieved with powder and lead? Or can Iliad be created with a printing press or even a printing machine? Does the singing and storytelling and the muse not necessarily cease with a printer's apprentice? Do the necessary conditions of epic poetry not disappear in this way? Many questions marked, but I think they are all question marks indicating rhetorical questions. So no longer confined to the realm of poetry and art, the magazine here gives also voice to another profession. And that's the interesting for our talk, which is another profession with a vested interest in constructing the socialist future in a quite literal sense, that is architects and urban planners. Alongside his fellow colleague, Karo Halapian, which would gain considerably more acclaim as the leading architect actually of the Soviet Union, and someone who would also turn his back on futurism and endorse Stalinist real socialism, which is again subject to another talk. But along his fellow colleague Karo Halepyan, another architect, 25 years old at that time, Mikhail Mazmanyan, should turn into one of the most vocal critics of Tamanyan's new Armenian city. That is the Armenian city of Yerevan we talk about today. Here we see a young and I think quite optimistic looking Mikhail Mazmanyan. The first documented encounter between Mazmanyan, the guy you just saw in the picture before, and Tamanyan, the one we saw with regard to the Garden City, took place in Moscow in 1924 on the sidelines of a movie screening of the film Hordain Hayastan. I haven't watched the movie, Soviet Armenia translates. Tamanyan was already a highly decorated architect, urban planner, and recently promoted chief engineer of the Soviet Narodnych Komissarov, the Council of People's Commissars. Mazmanyan, on the other hand, he was a second-year student at the recently founded experimental art school Buchtemas. I think people who work specifically on Soviet art, constructivism are very familiar with what they're doing. So this encounter, however, is captured in a retrospective account written by Mazmanyan himself, published in 1958, which you see here in the Armenian language journal Sovietakan Arvest, or Soviet Art. In what reads first like a flattery eulogy to Tamanyan, Mazmanyan admits to having been impressed by his legendary appearance, legendar Kerpari, and likened him with his tall stature and fast gait to Valentin Serov's depiction of Peter the Great walking along the river Neva. Yet, as it is with eulogies, we have to continue reading, the account soon acquires a more critical undertone. Upon return to Yerevan, Mazmanyan would meet with a close friend, the painter Matiros Saryan, which I think also many of the Armenian study field are familiar, who appeared visibly turned concerned about the ongoing urban development. So we see here some friction. What's happening? I quote here. Saryan was the first to talk about the construction, about Tamanyan and the new plan of the city, about the dilapidated houses that were about to be demolished, about the dissatisfaction of the Bakhmanchi residents, and the growing complaints that were related to the radical surgery of the city carried out by Tamanyan's project. However, this conversation prompted Mazmanyan, according to his own account, to reach out to Tamanyan himself. With a mixture of Lnukov that is fear and excitement, Mazmanyan accompanied his friend Halepyan and met Tamanyan sharply at 8 p.m. at his newly furnished studio in Yerevan. Tamanyan, upon welcoming both kindly as if we were old acquaintances, immediately got down to business, describing the location of the city, the relief, the strength and direction of the winds, providing detailed features of both his envisaged plan and the problems he encountered in its realization. After tea, he opened a large folder and started to show one by one original drawings of the masters of Russian classical architecture, such as Matvey Kazakov, Andrei Varanikhin, and Ivan Starov, which he had accidentally acquired from an old woman in St. Petersburg and thus saved from priceless loss. That's a direct quote from Tamanyan. Credited already prior to the revolution as the builder of the first garden city of Russia at the hospital town of Prozorovka. Udarenie is always the challenge in Russian. And near Moscow, Tamanyan was one of those architects of the imperial era who managed to reassert themselves in the post-revolutionary period. So very similar to people that we know in the post-Soviet period, like Aliyev and others that were able to reassert themselves after the Soviet Union fell. All in all, Mazmanyan's account is written in a distinctly cautious tone. Only occasionally does the critical voice of the author shine through here. For instance, when Tamanyan shows Mazmanyan a sketch of the project for the Palace of the Soviets in Moscow, which he had envisaged as a monumental ziggurat-shaped crowned by a monolithic statue of Lenin. Mazmanyan, I quote here, carefully expressed my amazement that the planned height would not fit the general scale of our capital meaning Moscow here. Otherwise, owed to the genre of a posthumous eulogy, he retained a distinctly flattering, almost exalting tone. I quote, Tamanyan's profile erudition blossomed before my eyes, egi to resplendent flower in full bloom. Zachki best ortswärts Tamanyan Haurus Yerudizian. So the retrospective account, and now it gets a little bit more exciting. It hardly suggests that, in fact, it was the young Mazmanyan himself who would burn bridges only a couple of years later after this chit-chat with Tamanyan. In a sharply formulated polemical article called A Nationale Architektur, or National Architecture, published in 1929, Mazmanyan would launch a fierce attack on Tamanyan in his efforts to forge an Armenian national style by combining, I quote, local traditional architectural forms and decor with the compositional techniques of Russian classicism. In his article, he scathingly remarked, and I quote here, the bourgeoisie, he refers to the new Armenianists, including Tamanyan and Bunatsian, was not able to create an organic culture in architecture. It mechanically transformed the forms and motives of Armenian historical architecture, church feudal architecture, ostensibly creating its own national architecture in opposition to architecture and culture of other nations, Georgians, Turks. In this way, they were pitting nations against each other, thereby delaying the way to a common international culture. With disdain, I quote him, he would observe how the Armenian bourgeoisie dreamed of creating its own national style in architecture. Everywhere domes, arches, crosses, and other attributes of national architecture would pop all across Yerevan. To visually underscore this here is quite polemically and sharply formulated argument. The article features illustrations of works such as Alexander Tamanyan's Ministry of Agriculture, you see here pictures on the left, or Nikolai Bunatsian's Agricultural Bank as a cautionary example and evidence for the horrifying anachronism, Ushasuyeshi anachronism, that in Mazmanyan's eyes informed the architecture. With regard to Tamanyan's ornamentations, he noted mockingly, we get here a close-up, so we know what he's actually talking about, we can judge for ourselves. Tamanyan notes mockingly, I quote, stylized bulls, nozzles, and birds in their symbolism coincide with the functions of the People's Commissariat of Agriculture. And in his personal notes, he would add on Bunatsian's work that the bank building was, I quote, taking away air, space, and our money, always reminding us that we are not living in the 20th, but in the 7th century. And with regard to another hotel erected by Bunatsian on Abovyan Street, he would remark that while busying himself with the construction of decorative columns, the architect, however, had entirely forgotten about air circulation inside the building. Talk about the time before the invention of AC. So, drawing inspiration from influential constructivist theories like Ginsburg, whom he esteemed as one of our best architects, I quote him as Mazmanyan, he emphasized and said the need for a critical exploration of architecture, as he understood it. He underscored the importance of contextualizing this heritage within the economic and social realities of the present, that is his own present. Architectural traditions of the past are certainly not to be, and I quote here, thrown off the ship of modernity. Mazmanyan conceded that, but according to him, they must be examined to extract functional elements that had stood the test of time. Upon his relocation to Yerevan in 1929, Mazmanyan joined forces with his fellow colleague Georg Kochar-Karokhalapian to establish a local chapter of the Organization of Proletarian Architects of Armenia, Organizacija Proletarskih Architektov of Armenia, to promote constructivist architecture within Yerevan. Soon also first graduates of the architectural department of the Technical Faculty of State University of Armenia, such as Ovanes Markaryan and Arsen Agoryan, would also flock in as well. Among the key topics here that sparked discussions and debates among members of ORPA was how to organize living spaces for workers. At the time, the Garden City had been dominating the discourse. Mazmanyan, however, contended that the Garden City would paralyze workers in their daily life and isolated them, I quote, within their separate gardens, separate households. Instead of turning one's, I quote again from him, melancholy gaze back to the age-old idol of the Garden City, he foregrounded the social element of housing, envisioning novel residential complexes with libraries, dining rooms, sport facilities shared by their inhabitants. Soon, the commune house, or kommunatun in Armenian, would form the core element in an effort to forge novel urban grammar geared towards the realization of a form of urbanity grounded in what Marx envisioned already in his work, German Ideology, as the ultimate telos of revolutionary activity, that is, the development of individuals into complete individuals. Finally, I can quote German, der Entwicklung der Individuen zu totalen Individuen. That is, as individuals no longer alienated from themselves, their economic self-activity and the social environment embedded. However, after a set of unrealized sketches, the first of its kind was realized between 1930 and 1932 in the vicinity of the covered market on Paroyan Street, intersecting with Mashtot's Avenue. Planned and designed by Mikhail Mazmanyan and Karo Halapian for the workers of the hydroelectric power station, the Yerevanskaya Hidroelektrostantsiya, the building, colloquially known as the chess house in Armenian, Shakhmati Tun, is regarded as one of Yerevan's most distinctive constructivist structures. The architectural historian and head of Museum of Architecture, Mark Grigoryan, further underscored the role vernacular architecture, like местная архитектура, played in his design. I quote here. I think we have this, here we have some pictures from the construction process of the Shakhmati Tun, presenting the apartment as one indivisible volume. Mazmanyan arranged these cell volumes in different configurations, following the folk traditions of dwelling construction, the principle of where the flat roof of the lower floor was the balcony of the upper floor. We see this specifically then realized with regard to experimental housing in the town of Rapan, actually. Again, subject to another talk. However, parallel to the construction of the Shakhmati Tun, Mazmanyan further contributed on distinctly more experimental projects, such as the commune house for the workers of a mechanical factory, which you can see here and which also featured wonderfully in the flyer. Thanks again, Vegan, for that. Co-authored here again with his colleague Karo Halapian, the building complex, which was to be duplicated 16 times, consisted of 2 terraced 6-story residential buildings with roof terraces connected by 3 cantilevered staircases. You can see this to a tower-shaped 7-story building in the center of the site. Yet, unlike the first, this ambitious project failed to be realized. It was only 3 years later, in 1933, the newspaper Hordayin Hayastan, Soviet Armenia, announced the realization of another commune house project, yet unprecedented in its scale. Written by Mazmanyan himself, the article introduces the reader to a future commune house settlement for the workers of the synthetic rubber factory, located in present-day Yerevan, so in the south of Yerevan. The article informs the reader that the settlement was being constructed on a 200-hectare plain in a picturesque location east of the Zango, nowadays Kharazdan River. Projected here for an average of around 4,000 people, which included the workers of the factory and their families, the plan envisaged the construction of 53-story buildings with 25 apartments each to offer housing at an estimated population density of 100 people per hectare. Here, for the architect who a few years later was to build the Yerevan Children's Railway with, I think those who've been to Yerevan might be familiar with the Yerevani Mankaran Gargatriki. The needs of children had already been inspired as a primary concern. I quote here, in all its use, the townlet should leave a cheerful, energetic, and sunny impression. Special attention is paid to the building of playpens and mangers, which in their composition and coloring should correspond to the psychology, taste, and hate of children. You know, we see as we move the present, the degree to which part of this has been achieved or not achieved, or has been dismantled. Furthermore, greenery and water elements is something you cannot see, but they actually are pools in each and every of these courtyards, were to be employed here to enhance the ambience in each residential quarter given Yerevan's hot climate. The planning and development of the settlement was here to follow a comprehensive approach, which integrated the architectural design of the building and the landscaping of its surrounding. This became clearly evident with regard to the inner courtyards here and of the smaller residential units. Here again, you have to kind of imagine, mentally you have to kind of remove the post-Soviet additions to the building, which you can clearly see here. And I would want to rather raise your attention to the upper part. Here the adaptation, and this now we're slowly moving to the Post-Persian, for those who wonder why that was in the title. The adaptation of local architectural traditions was of a particular interest and something that we do not necessarily encounter with other constructivist buildings, neither in Armenia nor elsewhere. In contrast to the clearly pronounced constructivist style of the front facade, I think I have to move you here back. This, you see the front facade. The back facade of the buildings facing a water basin revealed a starkly different image, much more reminiscent of the local architecture of Mazmanyan's own native hometown, that is Tbilisi in neighboring Georgianistan. Protruding wooden balcony rows overlooking a water basin in the courtyard inevitably evoked the balcony houses of 19th century Tbilisi. Colloquially known among residents as Italiuri Ezoebi, I do not claim to speak Georgian, I hope that is right. The structures rather correspond to a local adaptation of an element of Islamic architecture known as Shanashil in Farsi or Mashrabiya in Arabic, respectively. The architectural element is a type of projecting oriel window adorned with intricate wooden lattice panels, which you can see, for instance, when you visit like Sevilla or like Cordoba or Alhambra, I think one of the main sites where you can see this. Occasionally, it incorporated stained glass to enhance its aesthetic appeal. Historically, it served the purpose of capturing airflow and promoting passive cooling within the building. Mazmanyan, and this is understood from his writing, clearly understood the merits of vernacular housing architecture. I have here an interesting quote to underscore this. I quote, this is part of the quote. There are numerous questions tied to climate, geographical attributes, and more, which were effectively dealt with by traditional architects in their era. To illustrate this, consider the old houses in Tbilisi and Yerevan, renowned for their solid construction, lighting solution, flat roofs, terraces, various roofing materials, and importantly, the airy and cheerful aesthetics. When juxtaposed with the grim villa houses emanating an atmosphere akin to a monastery, it was not good for him, it becomes abundantly clear how fundamentally distinct these two architectural systems are. End quote. As reflected here by the unique properties of this communal house settlement, Mazmanyan and his fellow architects did not merely seek to imitate trends prevailing in modern architecture at the center of the USSR. Instead, and I think it's very interesting also for our current debate within the new framework of decolonization, they pursued the goal of forging a novel and original spatial and architectural language that blends latest trends in pan-Soviet constructivist architecture with the historical lore of regional vernacular architecture. But, and here we're coming to the literature ramifications, the vision of the commune house here not only fired the imagination of local architects and urban planners. Already 2 years before the construction of workers' quarter in Yerevan, the one we were just seeing, one encounters a vivid depiction of a commune house project bafflingly similar to that of Mazmanyan's project, given the size of Armenia, might be not a coincidence. We see this kind of bafflingly similar project in a debut novel of a surrealist writer, which has made a comeback almost 90 years after its initial publication, that is Mikhail Armen. For those who have not seen him, this is him. I won't get too much into details regarding his biography, but what's maybe interesting, coming back one more time to him, is that unlike some other leading figures, he's not from Yerevan, he's actually from Yerevan, which was a relatively multi-ethnic city, also largely inhabited by Muslim population. So I think this is something that's similar to Mazmanyan, and we see this also with Mazmanyan, who grew up in a multi-ethnic late Tsarist Tbilisi, has both in common, and we'll see how both of them should speak to each other in both his writings and in the architectural legacy that Mazmanyan left behind. So in Yerevan, a saga, this is a novel you see, which was basically republished in 2016 and it's now been reprinted. It's actually quite well received in the sense of controversial, but well sold. The interesting thing is that the book really became accessible to Armenian readers only now, since around 10 years, because the first issue was, as happens with some good art, was censored and banned upon publication. So the thing is, the book came out, it was interestingly printed in Moscow, not in Yerevan. I couldn't find out exactly why the book was also first printed in Armenian, but in Moscow. maybe Armen himself was living in Moscow at that time. I didn't find a reference in his biography on that. But the book came out. It was castigated by Soviet Armenian reviewers, which were one of the few who had the chance to read the book. And then the book was censored and banned and never to be republished, while he himself was rehabilitated, which is very interesting. He became one of these leading figures in the post-Stalinist period of Armenian literature, but this work was never to be published again. He's known for the Poem of Herina, but not for Yerevan. So in Yerevan saga, the writer native from Alexandropol introduces here the reader to Arshak Budakhyan, a fictitious young architect who, as the architectural historian Mark Grigorian rightly observes, I agree with this observation, is clearly modeled on none other than Mikhail Mazmanyan himself. The novel here weaves a complex plot centered around Budakhyan's dream of building his commune house, which he tellingly calls Nor Arevek, the New East. His quest unfolds against the backdrop of a fierce struggle against his opponent. I mean, every novel needs a good opponent, and I think he finds his opponent in the city's chief planner. I mean, who was the city's chief planner? It was Tamanyan. Here, it is not Tamanyan. It is Gurgen Parsadyan. The latter, however, bears an uncanny resemblance to Alexander Tamanyan. We should see this also now when we go more into the details of the book. On the outside, Budakhyan, the architect called to Yerevan, appears confident and clear-minded, yet his inside reveals a highly conflictual and ultimately tragic personality that I think speaks to the larger personal struggles that many persons experience who, on the one hand, aspired to build cities for a new socialist future, while they themselves were born and raised and socialized in what they perceived the old world, which also shaped the way how they made sense of the world. So admitting to the reader that he, I quote, became an architect to take revenge on and torment the unsuccessful poet, he once said, Budakhyan is torn between aspirations for the future city and a deeply rooted yearning for the old city that comes undone before his eyes, that is razed to the ground before his eyes. However, and to make it more dramatic, he is one of the architects that is in charge of raising this city down to the ground. In a kind of dreamlike, oniric sequence, he revisits his native district of Nork, which for those who've been to Yerevan, you can imagine like present-day Kont, basically, unlike, however, Kont did not retain its structure. This Nork is a Persian-era vernacular settlement at the outskirts of Yerevan and inhabited by a mix of Christian and Muslim populations. It's more and more while walking through Nork, that is the district he is the protagonist is born in. It dawns on him that the task, the mission to construct the new Soviet Armenian city will inevitably lead him to irrevocably destroy the old, and I quote here, city of the sun. Police. No, that's a perfect time to take. Thank you. You created the opportunity for me to have water. So it dawns on him that to destroy the old, to build the new city, he needs to destroy what he calls the Arevika. For those people familiar a little bit, they know that the sun hints here at the city's Persian legacy, where it symbolized Persian statehood, Shir-i Khorshid, right? The lion and the sun, both during the Safavid and the Qajar Empire, and actually going much further back into history. I'm not confident to speak here more about Persian history, but it's very interesting that we see here this kind of reference to the Persian city. And he's deeply torn. On the one hand, he recognizes here that this former imperial Persian city was a place of extreme inequality. An affluent center stood in contrast to a suburban periphery, what he calls the Kahaki Anzanot Masse, unknown part of the city where the enslaved peoples had lived for centuries far away from the eyes of the Khans and Aghas. On the other hand, however, there is the realization, and that's, I think, also a very personal realization, because for the better or worse, this is the city in which he grew up. This is the city that made him the person that he is. The realization that this century-old Yerevan, as he called Daravor Yerevan, is dying, Mernume hin Daravor Yerevan, and is dying before his eyes. And this animates him to explore ways of retaining certain aspects of the former city. you maybe remember the quote about Mazmanyan, about not casting the old, trying to find the functional elements of the old and to retain it, to bring it back in the new. So we see here this interesting overlap. He so fondly remembers from his own youth the city, and grief-stricken by the task to demolish his own native district of Nork, Arshak decides to hold a party at his neighbor Gabor. The night prior to the demolition of the district, he gathers what he calls all fellow enthusiasts of old Yerevan, listeners of the Ashok Hafizadeh, customers of Alak Hazan Obe, and admirers of Subeda, to participate in a symbolic funeral to the city. The four instruments that play this death march, the Mahvan Kailergi, Tar, Kamanche, Surna, and Dao, all refer to music instruments here, which have been widespread not only in Armenia, but across a vast Persian geography from the Caucasus to Iran up until Central Asia. However, with the arrival of the first construction workers, the elegy is soon drowned out by the deafening sound of the pickaxe, whose rhythmic hammering heralds the irrevocable destruction of the old. To hold a funeral of the deceasing city obviously challenges the hegemonic discourse of progress associated with the Soviet project, specifically under Stalin. Instead, it paints here a multi-layered and conflictual picture of how contemporaries experienced and reacted to rapid changes in their own environment. But even after this symbolic funeral, this mnemonic specter of the old city lingers on. In, I quote, every small house he comes to see the fragment of a shattered dream, he seeks to preserve and piece together the memory fragments left behind by the old Yerevan in the hope of reconstructing the old in a new, patchwork-like new city. And the opportunity in the novel arises so when Budagian, similar to Mazmana, is actually commissioned to submit plans for a future commune house. Soon, however, after he takes on the project, a fierce competition erupts. Maybe we have moved away too far from him, but there was this antagonist somewhere in the background, the Hamanyan-style Gurgen Parsadian. So, ringing Western hubris, his opponent's counter-project bears here the name Pachtanak, victory, Pobjeda, and is animated by, I quote, a love for ancient Greece. This is a quote from the novel. In contrast, Budagian ties his commune house project, Arevelk, or East, to the city's Islamo-Persian heritage. Addressing the former residents of Nork, he reassures that they will once again, I quote, find your flat roofs, the idle retreat during the sweltering summer months. Your cherished trees, vibrant flowers, and flowing waters are here to welcome you. Long live the East. Filled with enthusiasm, he conjures up the internationalist vision, a vision that's distinctly far away from our current present, of, I quote, bringing the architects of Georgia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan to Soviet Armenia to build an earthly paradise for the Ishchis and Fakhlas. So you see here, these words are direct usage in the Armenian novel. That is Ishchi, a Turkish word for the worker, and Fakhla also, you know, like in the Arabic context, the peasant workers. And here we see a further play on this Eastern theme. I quote here, once pilgrims came to Yerevan to see the Blue Mosque. Soon other pilgrims will take with them the image of a dream fulfilled to Persia, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Egypt, Syria, Palestine. They, as new dervishes, will tell the Muslim East where the real paradise is, which is, of course, the paradise of communism. However, and for the Armenian readers, they will be a little bit ahead of the time, the ensuing construction process turned out to be sobering. Limited production possibilities severely. So you see, it is in some sense, I don't know, he was accused for the novel being not so realistic, but I think the novel was maybe too realistic. So the ensuing construction process turned out to be quite sobering. Limited production possibilities severely hampered the realization of his architectural vision. Visiting the construction site, he finds it increasingly hard to believe that the unremarkable building being constructed is the Nor Arevek, the East, he had been dreaming of. Worse still, apart from the two architects themselves, no outsider who visits the construction sites seemed to be able to distinguish between the two construction projects. The fundamental conceptual differences of the two antagonistic architects boil down to, I quote, cabinets resembling cigarette boxes with a matchbox on top for Pasamian, and cabinets resembling mosque entrances with an arched door and a painted brick color for Budakian. In the closing section of the book, the failed architect notes here with resignation. And here we have this quote in Armenian. The idea was defeated. Shams has lost. The East has lost. Shams, obviously, a kind of twofold allusion, which is difficult to unpack. It might be a reference directly to the Persians, to the city's Persian heritage in the sense of to Shams Tabrizi. However, Shams also is the Arabic translation for Khorshid or for Arab, that is for sun. So it's difficult to say from this context whether it is Shams as a Shams Tabrizi or Shams in the sense of Arabic for sun. So wrapping up, and I think I'm good in time. Like I didn't make you too tired, too worried, hopefully. I think best speakers are always speakers who know when to stop. So from a retrospective point of view, Tamanyan's city and the county city imagined by Mazmanyan and Mikulic Armen make up, at first glance, for an extremely unequal pair. Tamanyan's project of the Neo-Armenian city has been firmly inscribed into the material landscape of today's city, literally chiseled into the characteristic pink tupstone that continues to dominate today's city center, and which everyone knows and also maybe appreciate during the time they visited Yerevan. However, fallen from favor under Stalin and ultimately repressed, the urban vision of his opponents has survived only as a silenced and fragmented legacy. A set of individual buildings scattered around the city. You saw the pictures. Blueprints stored away in private archives and written testimonies in the form of both autobiographical writings and fiction alike, as we have seen with regard to Armen's writings. Synthesizing here this varied mix of sources written in both Armenian and Russian, I sought to excavate from this precarious archival repository the counter-narrative here of another socialist Yerevan as a multi-layered and differentiated text written both on the pages of Armen's novel and right into the urban fabric of early Soviet Yerevan, as it is true for the material legacy of Mazmanyan. In stark opposition to the Neo-Armenian city, I showed here how Mazmanyan and Armen imagined Yerevan as a city composed of commune houses, communautaire, let's say communopolis, that drew less from European neoclassicism and the churches of medieval Armenia, but the more so from the vernacular architecture of the Southern Caucasus as part and parcel of a wider post-Persian space. Ultimately drawing here from and returning to Baumann's conceptual prism of Retrotopia, I sought to show here that imaginaries of the urban, both by Tamanyan and his opponents, were likewise informed here by a yearning, like garot, like a longing for a multitude, however, of antithetical paths. While Tamanyan's Neo-Armenian architecture grounds itself in the Retrotopia of a Christian West that links Armenian culture to like the neoclassicist architecture of the West, Mazmanyan's constructivist architecture, or his kind of own form, Spielform, I would say, his own variation of it, and Armen's surrealistic writings are largely rooted in a different Retrotopian image. It's the Retrotopian image of a vernacular East, or Arabic. And maybe it is an image of a vernacular East that can also bridge across the ethnic boundaries that demarcate Armenia with its very troublesome neighbors to left and right, the West and East today. Thanks a lot. Yeah, sure.
Feel some questions?
Sure. Yeah. Case there. Yeah, maybe Catherine.
Oh, okay. I was just going to ask about the relationship between Mugadic Armen and Mazmanyan, because clearly, you know, they're building off the same intellectual tradition. And so I was just wondering, especially, you know, because Armen's book is like it's so rooted in this architectural history, whether they had either any, I mean, direct relationship or whether they were kind of intellectual interlocutors.
Yeah, that's an interesting dark spot. The thing is, I got hold of the biography, not an autobiography, but a biography written on Nicholas Armen's life in the 60s, I think, by a guy called Leibniz. Don't quote me on that. But the thing is that, interestingly, there's no reference to any encounter between them, which makes it really interesting. Whereas there is some reference to an encounter between him and Charles, actually, at his later life, however. But I think at that time, as I understand him, the circle of Mazmanyan, Charles, above was a relatively established circle. And it seemed to me that Armen, in this biography, there's only reference that he was in Gyumri and was impressed when he read the Manifesto of the Three. So there seems to be a clear hierarchy in that sense, that Armen at that time was actually a young writer that was admiring Mazmanyan. He was admiring the writings of Chanel, but they don't seem to share the same, like Tusovka, the same environment. I think that's interesting, actually. And yeah. Catherine?
Thank you so much, David. You brought up, I mean, I have so many questions, but I will limit myself. And I thought what was so interesting was the ways in which these architects, Mazmanyan, and then these writers actually are trying to bring in and find their past, right, in this present and future. And so it's so interesting that the Armen, or was it Armen who actually laments the loss of the city around him?
In some sense, they both do it. Like there's almost literally the kind of analogous quote, like you have the quote, the old Yerevan is dying, almost verbatim in both Armen's novel and in an article written by Mazmanyan. So
yeah, especially since the Persian history has completely been erased from Yerevan today, right? So it's interesting that those tensions were definitely there and articulated. But my question is more about, you know, juxtaposing Mazmanyan and Tumanyan together, right? Because it's very different scales that they are working with. I mean, Tumanyan's project is a monumental project. So, of course, he goes back to really Sasanian palatial architecture, while Mazmanyan, because of maybe patronage, and I'd like to hear a little bit more, is working more on these kind of residential, domestic, communal buildings, apartment buildings, right? Spaces. And so I thought, you know, this juxtaposition maybe is a little bit, for me, odd. If you're only going to be looking at the kinds of influences and mixtures and pastiche of past within their own imaginations of the architecture, but I would love to know a little bit more about the different kind of patronage that's going on.
Yeah, thanks so much. Absolutely fair point. The thing is that the reason why I'm focusing specifically on Mazmanyan for two reasons. First of all, I think the legacy of Mazmanyan is not only omnipresent, but also very well researched. And for me, it was interesting to also reconstruct the alternative narrative that was quite dominant at the time, but has become fully marginalized by today, which is, I think, something that animates a lot of like historical research. So that is the thing. But I do not claim that they would ever reach the point where they would fully stand on equal footing. I agree fully with you. Although the interesting thing is that Mazmanyan makes his own return. It's something that, since I focus here on the 1920s and 30s, didn't address, but he's exiled to Norilsk and this is something that I couldn't address either. Both Armen and Mazmanyan are exactly exiled to Siberia almost at the same time, like in the 1-2 years, of course, during the Hammerstein terror. And Norilsk, and he comes back from Norilsk in order to be one of the leading architects for the expansion plan of the micro-districts after Stalin. So in some sense, Mazmanyan takes over Tamanyan, but he takes him over actually at the time when under Khrushchev it is about not about the construction of the center, but when it is about the construction of like the micro-districts, the suburbs of Yerevan. So in some sense he acquires this role, but you will never be able to realize the vision that he had for the city that he had in the 20s. And it's also up to question to which degree he's still identified with this vision. Because I know, for example, that interestingly, Mazmanyan himself would devote much of his efforts in his very late life before his death to the conservation of Armenian churches, ironically. So we see also, I think, this kind of interesting biographical evolution. This was not exactly an answer, but thanks a lot. Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Oh, let's have a panel first, and then we'll have a couple of questions from online.
Oh, okay. So, thank you for this talk. My question is about your sources. I mean, sort of, to my understanding, it's easy to imagine building the future. It is hard to build it. So I'm wondering whether the sources that you sort of have shown us so splendidly, kind of the journals, the models, the photographs, those different ways of imagining the future, whether that isn't the actual thing, it's not just the reference point of the actual city. But, sort of the debates go on in these journals and these, kind of various media, and that raises questions about the different construction of these media, how they are presented, who their audiences are, and how they're disseminated, and where debates around the city would have taken place. So I'd be interested in hearing you talk a little bit about all the evidence that you've collected.
Yeah. I mean, to sum it up in short, I would largely actually agree with what you're arguing. And I think some of the other talks focus also much more on the actual discourses. With regard to my own interest, I think I'm not only interested in reconstructing historical discourse, but since we do have some buildings from the constructive period actually in Yerevan, which also, and I think that makes the work maybe also a little bit political, are largely not perceived as architectural heritage. It is, I think, also interesting to kind of underscore the actual material traces. And we see there, I think the main two sites were the Shahmatidun, which I've showed, and also the largest constructivist residential ensemble is this quarter in Yerevan, which we mainly discussed. But of course, we have also other buildings which I didn't specifically address. For example, we have also a building in the constructivist style by Mazmanyan Halopian. That is the Slavic Theater in Yerevan. And there are a couple of other buildings. But you're right. I mean, the thing is, I am interested in some sense in a city that wasn't. So I am interested also in a kind of city that was imagined, and to also, in some sense, reconstruct the alternative vision. I think that is kind of interesting because it's a thing that is not, in some sense, omnipresent in the material world. And that ties in, I think, with the larger rationale of the book project, where I reconstruct different visions of urbanity. And this one, for example, in this sense, was a reconstruction of the notion of an indigenized urbanity. So I looked at what it meant to imagine the national city in light of colonization. And what I found very interesting, and this is a bit more explored in the chapter, is just to see that there was a commitment to the idea of building a national Armenian city, but it was far from clear how national Armenian culture should look like. And I think this is what really fascinates me about this period, to reconstruct this kind of contestation of different, multiple Armenian national cultures that are not yet settled, And I think in order to show this kind of contestation, how much Tamanyan was not the unchallenged, whether we like Tamanyan's architecture or not, but to reconstruct how much it was not the unchallenged pathway to Armenian national modernity, but that there were different pathways they were contesting. I think this is the thing that very much animates my research. And while, of course, recognizing the limit to which things were realized. Actually, we have to go with Gottfried and Lilith.
Online questions first?
Or should we?
No, go ahead.
I
just forget there are two more.
So the first one is from Michael Piper. Thank you for a very rich talk and fascinating project. I'm really looking forward to your next book. I was very curious if you see the battle over the contemporary relevance of the Persian spirit in Yerevan being played out in other ways during that period, or if it's more localized to these specific intellectual figures. The most obvious example to me, like I said, are the Rubaiyat writers by parents, Rubaiyat written by parents, and so I was just wondering to what extent you see those other figures, either futurist authors or less elite people, weighing in on the Persianate in their past or present at this time, and what that might tell us.
Interesting. Well, the short answer is actually I do not know. The longer answer, which is that I think that certain key terms seem to suggest that there was maybe not so much of a larger Armenian discourse that is possible, but a more of a transnational debate. Because we see also that the notion of no Arabic, which in Armenian, like, New East, comes up in its Russian variant as Novi Vostok in the context of the avant-garde of Uzbekistan at the same time. There's something I haven't looked into yet because it's something that I just came across recently, but I think this is something that needs to be done, I think, yet, which is to also contextualize it in the wider discussion that were going on in the quote-unquote Soviet South that is in Central Asia and the Caucasus. That's not exactly an answer because the question itself I cannot answer better, but I think this is something that I want to move on more. Yeah, okay. But thanks.
Yeah, and we have a second one here.
Okay.
Brilliant talk. Looking forward to the monograph. Apologize if I missed this, but it was curious. Both Tamanyan and Mazmanyan were engaged in a Retrotopian project in each of their traditions, grew from long-established architectural traditions. What made neo-Armenian architecture in the assessment of the futurist, bourgeois, nationalistic, and romantic? Was it Mazmanyan's influence from Soviet constructivism that saved him from a similar critique from other futurists? Was it that he did not create the task?
I think there's this interesting framing. Hopefully I remembered right from the granddaughter of Mazmanyan is also working on his work, and she has this quote where he says she summarizes his work as rejecting the blind call of the past. What does it mean? I think that there's a consensus that both constructivist architects and neoclassicist architects are drawing from the past in order to build the future city. I'm just now kind of reconstructing the critique from the side of constructivists. They would argue that, yes, we are also drawing the past is the kind of lore, is the kind of legacy that empowers us to build the architecture of today. But we are interested in the functional aspects. What they would reject, and that we saw with regards to, actually, let's move there, it's very fast. What they would reject is a kind of ornamental appropriation of the past. And this is something very typical, I think, for neo-Armenianism, to use certain elements of the architecture that's not specifically fulfilling any practical use value, like here, these things. I mean, you can find them beautiful or not, but I'm not necessarily siding with the constructivists. The constructivists would argue that this is something to be rejected. At some point, maybe it made sense, but in the present day world, this doesn't follow any in any kind of function. Whereas, for example, to appropriate the flat roofs and the step-like construction of buildings in vernacular southern Armenia and other parts of the Persian Empire, or to use the shanashil, the mashtabir that blocks out the sun. These are functional things. These are functional things that are passed on from us to the past and present. And that would be something that they would reappropriate. So I think, yes. Yeah. Maybe we need, I think we have to go with the line, but I will not forget it. So Lilith, you, and then Ron, and then we come back to you. Okay.
Thanks so much for the talk and the visual presentation as well. I was wondering what your stance is on why this Christian West and Tamanyan eventually wins over Mazmanyan and the Arabic, and kind of I think in the context of today as well, like the little 2-3 pockets that we have left in Yerevan, in a way they are being demolished in this Tamanyan. And then Narek Sargsyan, who was the architect of Yerevan until a couple of years ago. So he was basing a lot on Tamanyan's work as well. So if there's this, the why kind of, if you have any stance on that.
I think the why, I can only answer for one person, but it's an important person, which is Karo Halapian. With Karo Halapian, I found the biographical evidence. He joined, actually, he went to the Architectural Congress as a part of a Soviet delegation and visited together with the delegation Pompeii. He was deeply impressed by Pompeii in a kind of eerie way, in a similar way how Speer also was impressed by Italian ruins, like the Nazi architect. Because what he said, and I'm again quoting him directly, but he said like that the ruins kind of like testify to a civilization that was built for eternity. And I think this notion of eternity, by the way, which you never see coming, that's an interesting transition. When you look at constructivist or futurist writing, it's all about transition. It's all about, the kind of rush in the buzzing cities. But there you see a shift towards the idea of epic architecture, like architecture that is meant to last eternally, and ruins that speak to the glory of a bygone past. So with Halabian, we see this shift happening there. Of course, that's an anecdotal thing. What's happening more is this general shift towards socialism in the Soviet Union. But with Halabian, we see also this on a very personal level, actually. Ron?
First, thank you, David. It was great. You might want to keep your word you invented, buzzling, which is not English, but
I have an answer to this.
It brings together busy, bustling, and buzzing. And maybe you could use something like that. So what impressed me was that this article that Mazmanyan wrote was published in 1929.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very important moment, right? And your novel by Mukaddesh Armen is published in 1931.
Mm-hmm.
And this period, 1929 to 1931, is a radical turn to the left, in Soviet everything, right? It's the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah.
And therefore, that particular article with that strong a critique is an assault and has very serious political ramifications. It could. People who are attacked in that period, it's happening in literature, in painting, in sculpture, and everything else, could be killed. This is not a joke. Now, in fact, that doesn't happen because after 1931, we switch back to neoclassicalism and Tamanyan wins that battle, et cetera, until you go back to tradition and all that. The interesting thing is that these two guys survived. They must make some adjustments. I don't know their whole history if they end up supporting the church. So that's one thing I think you can add to that. The other thing is on Catherine's question about patronage. By 1929, if that's what we're talking about, there's only one patron, and that's the government, the state. It could be local governments, it could be national governments, it could be the Union of Architects. So that might be something to look at, but it's basically, basically the state. The final thing I wanted to say was that I often get confused when people talk about temporalities, but this talk is built on all kinds of temporalities about different ideas of the past, how much of the past comes in, whether we're building a future, etc. And I wonder if either in the book or in the talk, there isn't a way that could be a kind of part of the architecture of what you're doing.
No, I think temporality would be a really great key notion. It comes up here and there, but it's not really fully employed as a concept. But I agree with you. I think it could work very well, specifically in order to capture this return to different paths, right? Yeah. Because what's interesting is that it's not like, because on the, let's say, surface level, the struggle between neo-Armenianism and constructivism might first appear like struggle between the future and the past. But it's not quite about that, it's rather about which past and which ideas of the past and which conceptual imaginations of the past come to inform the present and which should not. Just a small thing about buzzling. I agree with you, we should change it to buzzing, but I'm actually not the first one in the English language who used this word. It has been out of usage for the last 400 years. Waitley, 1639, used it the last time. Puritan preacher.
And there's a lot of economies here. They'll be happy to hear it.
But yeah, point taken, thank you. I think we had here one, and then Hazan there.
Thank you very much for this eye-opener lecture for me. I knew almost nothing about Armenian architecture, especially in that. My question is that one of the slogans of the constructivists was not the old, not the new, the necessary, only the necessary. And in that context, it's all the things that come into being by systems. Like your architect, that detail is a stone architecture. And the constructivist side, steel, concrete, etc. And how did that ever enter into the discourse for the future? That's my first question. The second is that if they were looking at city plannings of the past, and you mentioned the Socialist, there are still remaining examples of so-called perfect cities, both in the Socialist and the Ottoman. Was there any discourse about looking at those for a starting point or focal point for planning city planning?
The second question is easy to answer because I haven't encountered any specific reference to let's say, Sassanid era Persian architecture. Like when they refer to Persian architecture, they largely refer to the vernacular architecture post-Persian space. So they talk about like basically residential housings. And that links actually to your first question. A specific case where I've encountered specific reference to building materials, which it's great that you brought up. It's really an essential part of the constructivist debate, was in Soviet Kazakhstan. I forgot, I can find it later on for you. It was for which town it was envisaged. I think it was within the framework of building houses in Kizil-Ordu, actually, in what was then the first capital of Soviet Kazakhstan, if I'm not mistaken. There they were experimenting with wood and straw building constructions, actually, also in the similar vein in order to emulate existing traditional architecture. So that is the case I can think of. I didn't encounter specific reference to building materials in the writings of Mazmanyan that I studied. But that is not to say that they are not there. Just encounter. But thanks so much. Yeah. Now we had Hazal, right? And then, yeah. No, you were first, I think.
Thank you, David, for this fascinating talk. I learned a lot. My first question is on the focus on Yerevan. Was there were there any efforts to extend to the other cities in Armenia, Gyumri or Dilijan? Or was this imagination only limited to Yerevan?
For the constructors?
Yeah.
Actually, I think, to my knowledge, Gayan Shagoyan might be the person to address. She's leading anthropologist in Armenia. And I know that she's working on a quite similar topic, that is the contestation of urban architectural landscapes in early Soviet Gyumri. And I know that she has also some discussion on what she calls, I think, neo-Orientalism, how she refers to this appropriation of the East by constructivist architects. There was something on Gyumri, I know. And from Mazmanyan, I know that he also realized a project in Rappan also, but not as a kind of holistic. It was not, to my knowledge, there was not an entire debate on that, but Rappan was also a small place. Whether there was something on Gyumri, I think Gayan Shagoyan will know much better than I do.
Yeah, my other question was about more about the intellectual trajectories of these people. Do we know whom they read, whom do they taught, or were there conferences, international, imperial knowledge networks?
Good question. Yeah, I actually honestly do not know yet. But but we were talking with regard to Armen, that there are interesting references and also resemblances that remind of also the writings of Baudelaire of the 19th century, which I think, since they were translated to Russian, certainly I would not be surprised if he had access to this. I mean, but I couldn't. The problem is I had hoped to find out much more about these questions in the biography of Armen, but it was actually a little bit disappointing. Disappointing. You know this as research. You never know what you get in your hands. Sometimes it's a treasure, and sometimes it's a bit of a disappointment. I didn't find any reference to this. And I had hoped to find something.
Follow up on that part.
Yeah, you both.
Actually, she had kind of already asked the question I was going to ask. I was going to ask if the same kind of debate happened for other arguments.
Yeah, I mean, no, I'm good. I hope that there are no Stepan Akeksis here. But the question is also what we did understand as a city, because there was this large, I think, from a lot of Armenians who would come from Baku, from Tbilisi to Yerevan, they would even contest the kind of the claim to urbanity that Yerevan had. So I think that I'm not sure whether there was really a kind of documented debate on the city, apart from Gyumri, because Gyumri was a city like Alexandropol that was actually more relevant than Yerevan until Yerevan became the Soviet Armenian capital, I think. So in this sense, for Gyumri, there's certainly something, for a city in the northern part of Armenia. But about others, I'm not sure. Yeah.
So I'm directly sort of building on what Hazar was asking, because it's so striking how, to what degree that debate and sort of the different sort of tendencies here sort of mirror what's going on in Turkish architecture in the exact same period. And I'm always also tempted to ask you to what degree sort of walking through Ankara as a student sparked some of this, because there's this whole thing about the way sort of architectural theoreticians like Grunewald, for instance, talk about national versus local versus international architecture. That is so embedded in what you're dealing with. And it would be kind of amazing to think that this is happening in such a similar way, only through osmosis at that point, whether there is sort of shared intellectual debate that does not quite surface to the level where it gets. So, but I'm really curious how you think about sort of these parallels.
I'm actually really happy about this question because you helped me to bring in something that I had to cut out, which is these interesting parallel trajectories of Corbusier and Mazmanyan. And Istanbul is the meeting point. So interestingly that we have both Mazmanyan actually traveling to Istanbul and taking sketches and being strongly impressed actually by learning also from Ottoman architecture of that time. And the interesting thing is that the famous diaries of Corbusier, where he travels from Europe also until Istanbul and through the Balkans in quest of unearthing or unlocking the functional meanings of modernist architecture, also takes him over the Balkans, however, from the other road to Istanbul. So in some sense, they both probably never met. But the interesting thing is that they both take a trajectory with Corbusier from like Switzerland and from Mazmanyan from Soviet Union. But they both have this meeting point, in some sense, the point of encounter and missing encounter in Istanbul. So I think there's definitely something there. And I think that's also, in some sense, also a kind of what is for me, for example, a remaining question, a riddle that I couldn't solve, was to which degree was the personal really disposition, also the longing, the yearning, this own perspective feeds into this reappropriating the vernacular architecture, or to which degree they really implement certain principles of or kind of certain trends in modernist architecture at that time. Because also with Corbusier, you saw this strong like interest in like, for example, I forgot where it was, but it was an Italian monastery. And he was really like, it was one of the for him most impressive experiences to visit this monastery and to unlock the kind of like spatial organizational design of this monastery. And he would take these things up in order to kind of delineate his own modernist pathway. So this thing was very common to look at specifically vernacular architecture. I mean, monists were often very critical of like this kind of like, architecture that serves more of, like, say, epic purpose, like churches, temples, but not only. I mean, also Corbusier uses sketches from ancient temples also, but they really were very much interested often in more vernacular architecture. So this is a common theme, and it's difficult to say what plays into what. Like, at least I wasn't able to answer this question right there. Yeah, right.
Sorry to be so negative. If you go back to your very first slide, or the one where you asked the question that the book is circulating around, which is a wonderful book. Question. I mean, I teared up thinking of it, of what the implications of it were.
I'll get them.
Yeah, I'm sure you will.
Almost like early cinema.
Yeah.
I know. I think that's the question.
That's the question. Yeah. So what does it mean 3-day to inhabit circuit cities built for truths that never arrive? How would you answer that question from this chapter? What's the argument that you would make?
Yeah, I think the argument I would make is that it's possible to have a architecture that is rooted in a indigenous culture, in that sense also an Armenian culture. However, that is not necessarily to be juxtaposed to the Eastern Muslim culture that surrounds Armenia in one sentence. I think this is the argument. One can say more. Yeah. What do you think?
Well, it's just that the way you presented it, which was so intriguing, is that there were a bunch of different futures that were presented and possible. And one of the most traditional succeeded.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing is also for me to show that the city, I mean, it's something that is in some sense self-understood, but still needs to be stressed how much the pathway to the Soviet city is a polyphonic account, a basmashahor account, to have the Armenian word again. So in the sense that like these different visions of the city were sometimes complementary, but in some case they were almost juggernauts. They were also opposing visions of the city. And for me, it's also interesting to reconstruct in some sense beyond the kind of stereotype of the Soviet city as like the Panelka, which of course I have a chapter also on micro districts to show actually what other discourses animated the quest to the socialist city actually. Yeah. And I try to sketch them and I reconstruct all of these visions. And then I look at how do they speak to our present? How do they speak to the present of the place? But how do they also transcend it? So for example, when I look, for example, at the micro districts in Bishkek, I tie in also with current debates on the 15-minute city, because when you actually deconstruct Carlos Moreno's work on the city, like which informed the reconstruction of Paris into arguably the world's first 15-minute city, then you basically see the same recourse to the neighborhood unit by Clarence Perry that you have in the micro district. So you see these interesting also translocal and transtemporal connections and how, in some sense, the Soviet past, at certain aspects of the Soviet past, have much to say to the present if we create a room for a cross-temporal dialogue.
I come with this, of course, as a Soviet historian, and it's in the context that the one that succeeds is the least internationalist. That is what succeeds is what Stalin prefers. And so Tamanyan wins out, and constructivism and those kind of experimental things, which are sort of transnational or international, seem to fade away.
Yeah, and we see this with regard to Bishkek too, because they're the first point of departure for organization is that of a Esperanto-speaking internationalist commune. This is how the story of Bishkek as a Soviet city actually starts. But this is not the way how, in retrospect, today Bishkek is reimagined. I don't know who's been to Central Asia, but Bishkek is largely framed in very ethno-nationalistic terms, specifically since Japarov came to power. And in the whole monumental landscape is that of epic historian heroes, which very much superseded the idea of a fairly international city, which was, unlike Yerevan, which always had a very strong, Armenian majority. Bishkek was, I think, the international city par excellence. So we see this in both cases. I just want to echo it.
Well, as a person who lives in Yerevan, may I add something?
Yes, sir.
This constructivism means that this is a discourse and it takes forever. Like people living in those houses, you may see even on this picture that windows are very different, which means that they were, added by the people who were receiving those apartments in a standard way, and they try to inhabit them. This is partly an answer to the question. And by doing that, they were adding something in a standard way, not to be punished, but in a way which is a bit flexible. And Armenian symbolics is an option to be added inside the house or outside also, pomegranate something, to make this building a house. So this is the difference. The state was providing, people belonging to labor class with buildings. And those people were trying to inhabit them by adding symbols. So to make this building a house. And they still do. This is the tragedy of this, Soviet constructivism, that it's you can't make it a house the way you want, but you all the way try.
I mean, this is not from constructivism to be this building is from the post-Stalinist period, which is second wave modernism. So, which in some sense is a revival, but I think what you see here it's not a good example, but the interesting thing is with regard to Bishkek, I agree with regard to Armenia, and the question would be why, which is in Bishkek, you have in the second wave modernism, a largely employment of local architectural ornamentation. So if you would see the same panelki in Bishkek, you would have actually largely local ornamentation. And also with Uzbekistan, I think it's even better example with the huge, like, mosaics, which all employ actually or cite local traditions, which I think comes very close to what you said, the thing that then maybe in Yerevan people would do individually. Why did that not happen in Armenia? I don't know, but this would be a good further study. And yeah, I think Vigan, you have?
Very time, so.
So, yeah, thanks. Let's all thank David.